Welcome to our next series of Lacan lectures. As you may be able to see, we have changed location. Welcome to our new home. We're in the Lacan workshop, otherwise known as my garage, and we're very happy to have you here. And as I introduce this new home studio garage site for our Lacan lectures, it seems to me an appropriate time to make the move, given that our lecture today, first in a series on the theme of the Lacanian Unconscious. So one could ask, is the garage geographically more of an unconscious relative to the rest of my house? Anyways, I'll leave you to consider that. So, as I mentioned, it's the first of a sequence of talks where we will approach the concept of the Lacanian unconscious. This seems to me particularly important in as much as there are many attempts to dismiss Lacanian theory which already seem to assume that it adheres strictly to many notions within Freud. Now, of course, Lacan himself and Lacanians would say, yes, we're all about the return to Freud. So there is that. But I think it's also important to think a little bit critically and carefully about what the Lacanian unconscious might be, because I think it's a very different concept than many stereotypical or reductive understandings of the Freudian unconscious are. So for the first of these, towards the Lacanian unconscious, I've given us the title, The Transsubjective. And this will just be a short getting our head around some of the concepts and some of the crucial ideas in thinking about what the Lacanian unconscious might be. You could say that if we're going to introduce the topic of the Lacanian unconscious, we could return to two of the most famous maxims, two of the most famous statements that Lacan often repeated and circulate as a way of trying to characterize the Lacanian unconscious. The first of them, obviously, many people will be aware of it already, is the idea that the unconscious is structured like a language. The unconscious is structured like a language. The second is the idea that the unconscious is the discourse of the other. So you could say, as we're going to move forward, we need to have a good understanding of what language, linguistic processes might be, if we're to fully understand how the unconscious might be structured in that way. And we also need to understand something about the notion of the big other, if the unconscious is the discourse of the other. So those are two of our challenges. We want to try and understand those concepts. But on the way to doing that, we need to ask a couple of questions. We've said that both the big other and language are going to be crucial to understanding the Lacanian unconscious. So let's start with a preliminary question. Where would we locate language? What is the home of language? What is the location of language? This seems particularly important because as we approach the topic of the unconscious, many of us will already have this kind of binary tension between the idea that the unconscious is distinctive about me, or my unconscious is, that it's singular, that it's individual, that it's somehow intra-psychic, that it's kind of within me and defining of me. That individual locus, the individuality of the unconscious is crucial. On the other hand, we've all been exposed to the notion of a collective unconscious, the kind of Jungian idea that we have collective symbols and archetypes which populate the unconscious. Where do we locate Lacan in terms of these two notions? An individual or intra-psychic unconscious, or a collective unconscious of symbols? Lacan's not going to fit into either of those. In other words, and I think this is the thrust of the theory that we've been trying to describe as we've thought about notions like the big other. Lacan doesn't want to have a notion of the unconscious which is reducible to the internal, to the intra-psychic. And he similarly doesn't want to have a notion of the unconscious which is reducible to the social domain or to the collective symbolism of someone like Jung. You could say then that the concept that we really need to do a little bit of work on is the notion of the transsubjective. Sometimes in the Lacanian literature there's this distinction, there's a dismissal of the idea that the unconscious is either simply individual or collective, that it's somehow in between, that it's trans-individual. I think that's an apt and accurate characterization. But for our purposes here, we're going to think about the transsubjective. That's a concept that we're going to work on. That's a concept we're going to try and understand, because once we understand the notion of the transsubjective, I think we have a better sense of how the Lacanian unconscious, which I would argue is by definition a transsubjective unconscious, as it were, is located indivisibly between those two poles. Now, having made that characterization, if you've already watched some of my lectures on the notion of the big other, you'll remember that one of the characterizations I offered was that the big other can be seen as indivisibly between the subject and the social world, between the psychical stuff of an individual subject and the structural sociological stuff of the world around them. The big other seems to be somehow indivisibly between. It's kind of mediator between those two things. The same holds, I think, of the Lacanian unconscious. It's indivisibly between those two things. And in a sense, we already are able then to make some headway with the idea that the unconscious is the discourse of the other. If the unconscious is the discourse of the other, and the big other is by definition indivisibly between those two domains of the individual psyche and the societal structural domain that they occupy, then by definition the unconscious must likewise be between those two things. So we want to keep that idea in mind. But just before we start to refine and play with and explore a little bit more the notion of the big other, let's just give a few other Lacanian ideas. And some of these I've already touched on. One of them is the idea that desire is always the desire of the other. In that formulation, desire is always the desire of the other, one has a sense that the subject is not cut apart from the big other. The very stuff of the desire of the subject, and that's often the kind of thing, the desires, the fantasies of the subject that we would consider to be some of their most intimate, private, particular, defining, unique elements of the subject. They're the stuff of their own desires. Those things are always formulated in this kind of conversation, this kind of dialogue, this kind of hypothesize, what does the big other want? And I like that formulation in as much as, again, we're going to do two things with that. Qui vuoi? In other words, what does the other want? This, in a way, is the Lacanian formula of fantasy. What does the big other want? And of course, it echoes very strongly the idea of desire is always the desire of the other. That seems to suggest that fantasy, the engine of fantasy, what keeps fantasy, unconscious fantasy going, is my hypothesis. That's too much of a cognitive kind of word because it's an unconscious hypothesis, but nevertheless, my best guess, my ongoing hypothesis about what I think the other wants. Why I like that is that it would suggest that the engines of fantasy, the engines of the unconscious, are very much process, guessing, hypothesis, a kind of imagined dialogue, an attempt to try and fathom what people around me find to be important. What do they find to be desirous? How do I situate myself in those desires? So not only here do we have a sense that the unconscious is not static, but the unconscious is process, and it's always some kind of, again, dialogue's not quite the right word, it's some kind of process and engagement with my hypothesized best guess at what the other wants. So the unconscious here is necessarily process, it's not static, and it's always about the subject in its engagement with the other. It's not insulated in an individual subject. Okay, so we've highlighted a couple of these ideas, each of which is going to suggest that, to reiterate once again, the unconscious is neither simply individual or collective, and likewise the unconscious cannot be reduced simply to the internal or to the external. Yes, as we've seen when we've listened to and thought about Bill Clinton saying, I did not have sexual relations with that woman, the one location of the unconscious that we can be sure of for Lacan is within language, the processes of language, the substitutions of language, the extensions of language, the very activity of, as it were, linguistic processes. That's the domain of the unconscious. So at that level, one could, I suppose, start to say that just as language can never be definitively located within me, or within the broader societal domain exclusively, the same indivisibility applies to the unconscious. It's in that space in between. So back to the question then. What is the location of language? Well, location of language would seem to be the whole community of language speakers. I think that sounds viable. It's not simply within me. And if we make that point, we're making a nice strategic assertion that we're not thinking about language simply as owned by me. And by extrapolation, we're not thinking of the unconscious as simply my own provenance, my own ownership, simply the domain of my intra-psychic world. it's more distributed. But by the same token, couldn't we also argue that, well, the way you're using language right now, Derek, with your funny accent, the way you accentuate certain words, the way you speak, the way you articulate, the tonality of your voice, the grain of your voice, all of those things, the enunciative vocabulary stylistics of how you speak do seem to give it a certain kind of individuality. I'll say, thanks, it's really nice of you. But somehow between those two tensions, the fact that I'm giving, let's wonder, let's hope, some unique articulation, some unique speaking voice to a language which I can never fully own, which is haunted with idioms from a bygone era, which inherits words, concepts, phrases, notions from the symbolic realm, you could see that same tension again. So basically, I'm reiterating my same point. Language, I think, cannot be located simply within a social domain, and neither can it be located simply within the unique articulatory abilities within a given speaker. It seems to be somewhere in between. The same holds for the notion of the unconscious. It resists internal and external categorizations, just as it resists individual or collective categorizations. I want to make two more qualifications, and we'll round up this introductory lecture. There's an interesting moment when Claude Levi-Strauss makes a comment. Lacan is always, and usually, very positive when referring to Claude Levi-Strauss's work. There's lots of analysts, theorists, scholars whose work he makes reference to, sometimes very obliquely, sometimes without mentioning their name, often very disparagingly, but Claude Levi-Strauss seems to be a little bit of an exception. He likes Claude Levi-Strauss, and he, of course, as we know, he kind of takes Levi-Strauss's notion of the symbolic order, and that notion of the symbolic order is going to be very important to how we think the unconscious. But just one phrase from Levi-Strauss that seems to me important here. There's a moment somewhere where Claude Levi-Strauss says, well, one shouldn't mistake the processes of a stomach for its contents. And I'm like, dude, what are you talking about? Well, you could say the same thing with the unconscious. When we're thinking about the unconscious, and of course this happens in Freud a lot, we tend to think about the unconscious as a noun, as a thing, or as some kind of container, as some kind of receptacle. It's Freud's garage, whatever. Freud's basement would be a better analogy. We tend to think about it as a collection, or as a thing, or as a kind of repository, or as a kind of well, where you have these drive impulses and evil impulses and instincts, which is the incorrect translation of drives. All of these things characterize the Freudian unconscious. But if we go back to the Claude Levi-Strauss notion, don't confuse the contents of the stomach for the stomach and its processes, that gives us a nice, playful analogy by which we can say something like, yes, there may be many meaningful significations, many productions that come out of the unconscious, but that doesn't mean that the unconscious is thing-like. It doesn't mean that the unconscious is a place. Rather, we can imagine the unconscious is akin to the digestive processes that have certain things that come out, that take certain things in, but what I would like to take from that analogy is that the unconscious is processes. The unconscious is processings. The unconscious is, and this comes from later interpretations of Lacan, maybe Lacan himself, the unconscious is constantly, you could say, interpreting things. So if you imagine thinking about dream process, what's going on with dreams? Well, a lot, and we'll move on to talk about that in a lecture or two from now. But what dreams seem to be doing is taking psychical content, both from the outside world and giving it inflection with events, previous events that have happened to the individual, and they do a kind of processing. They use substitutions, they use extensions, they use metaphors, they use displacement and condensation, to use the Freudian language, to do a kind of treatment of that material. Interestingly, you could then say that the unconscious is not just processing, but a kind of interpreting, which makes a nice analogy for thinking about what psychoanalytic work might be like. So just while we're there, sorry, brief tangent, but it just helps make this point. If dreaming and dreamlike primary processes in Freud are an example of the unconscious at work, and indeed, if they are also an example of how the unconscious treats materials, subjects them to various processes, then it's interesting to think about the dream state as itself a kind of analysis. And it's interesting to wonder, could psychoanalysis itself be a kind of dream state? Now, we might be going a little bit far with that. That sounds like a kind of extrapolation 1.2 far. But my own sort of personal anecdote reflection here is the last time I went to the Freud Museum in London, one of the things that hit me about it, the place where Freud actually does or did do his work, with all the tiny little statues and the famous picture of Egyptian, I don't know if it's got the Sphinx in it, probably does, the Sphinx, pyramids, the low lighting, all the ancient figures, is what a kind of somnambulistic, sleepy space that was. Anyways, we're moving a little bit far from our point, but to just take those backward steps to retrace our logic, the unconscious is a set of processes. It treats material, it treats psychical content, it finds substitutions, it finds extensions, and you could say in a way, it's a kind of interpretive action. Why I've stressed that so much is Lacan doesn't want to think about psychical processes and Freud's concepts in the concepts of nouns, of objects, of things. The unconscious is not noun-like, it's not thing-like. And although many Lacanians may deny this, you could say that here Lacan is taking a leaf from the page of phenomenology. Phenomenologists are always very keen to say that consciousness, human consciousness, is not thing-like. It cannot be objectified. Why? Well, partly because it is precisely defined by intention. It's defined by the fact of its intentionality, which means it's about things. It's constantly referring to things outside itself. It itself, thus, is less of an object than an aboutness. And in an odd kind of way, you could say a similar logic holds for Lacan. The unconscious is not a thing. It's rather, and here we could slightly alter the analogy, it's maybe not so much an aboutness or an intentionality, or it would be a very interesting kind of intentionality if we were to make that leap, but it's a set of processes that treats, that interprets. In other words, going back to Levi-Strauss's analogy, it's more like, you could say, the digestive processes of a stomach rather than its contents. So that was the first kind of concluding point. The second was just to say that that is a useful idea to bear in mind when one's trying to do a kind of analysis. What is one looking out for? What is one specifying? What is one trying to see? One's not trying to find the object contents of an unconscious cast of characters. Rather, one's trying to see how the active living subject is constantly involved in the processes, the unconscious processes of treating their world, of giving it some kind of signification, and how those significations start to take on a life of their own. That's also a nice way of thinking about dreams.